We're going to dive into an environmental topic today that concerns more people than you might actually be aware of. And the issue is access to clean drinking water. Now, this is the first in a two-part series on accessing clean water, whether it be for drinking or recreational purposes. And you may be surprised to learn that neighbors, even in your own backyard, may not have access to clean drinking water. And if that's an issue in the state of Iowa, then I'm sure it's an issue in other states as well. Welcome to Health, Harmony, and Happiness with Kathy. I'm your host, Kathy Stricker. I'm a wife to a law enforcement officer and mama to 3 lively littles. I'm a business owner, yoga teacher, health coach, and wellness and life enthusiast. And what I really like doing is connecting others like you with resources that could bring you health, harmony, and happiness on your life journey. These 3 elements are a result of that inner light that flows naturally through you and brings contentment. They happen when you seek to live mindfully as your best self and tune in to following this inner guidance. May this podcast serve as a nudge to discover tools that could help you on your path towards more conscious living. Hey friends, I've heard from a number of you that you are actually listening to the podcast more from my website directly rather than using a service like Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or one of the other numerous directories that are out there and that bring podcasts to us. So today I'm asking if you would take a moment to actually go out there to one of those platforms like Apple Podcasts or Google Podcast and actually subscribe to this show. That helps tremendously in growing the show and getting it out there in front of more listeners. And of course, continue to visit the website for show notes and resources from the episode. But it's the downloads that come from listening through a podcast directory that actually help to get the podcast in front of more people. And now you know a little bit more about the behind the scenes stuff of podcasting. But we are here for an episode, so let's get into today's topic. Hey everybody! This month we've been focusing on creating harmony within our environment, and specifically in the outdoor environment we spend time in. And since most of us are very much homebound right now, it's a great time to get outside and be in nature. Our weather in Iowa hasn't really been super fantastic during this quarantine time, which can be a bit discouraging, but that definitely does not mean you can't go outside and explore. Use that time to connect with your family and to connect with nature as well. It's a great time to be in nature, I guess. So since this episode will be airing on Earth Day, I want to share with you something that my family does on or around Earth Day. I like to take my family on an Earth Day walk down our road. We live on a little bit of gravel and then a county road as well. But we just grab some garbage bags and gloves and set off with the wagon and pick up trash in our ditches. And we started this a couple years ago, but now it's something that my 6-year-old is well accustomed to and will bring it up even when it's not Earth Day. So it's kind of fun that he's being mindful of that. And it not only makes our road look nicer, but it also cleans up the potential pollution that could come from the garbage that's just sitting in the ditches. Early spring is a great time to do this if you are thinking of doing this or interested in doing this at all in your own neighborhood, because at least where we live, and we do this with the ditches, the grass is short and it's still kind of dormant. So it's very manageable and you can easily see the garbage and you can walk into the ditches to pick the garbage up. But like I said, if you do live in town, if you live in a city, do this in your neighborhood. I'm sure that there is trash littering the sidewalks and just those places in between buildings that maybe don't get looked at very often, but it's still there and it's still a great way to keep your neighborhood looking nice. So no matter what age, this is something that anybody can do, and it's easily accessible, but it gives you an opportunity to connect with and to give back to nature. And if you have kids, like I said, you'll be teaching them about being mindful of how our choices impact our environment. And I guess that some of that litter probably ends up in our waterways would be my guess. And based on some of the ditches that I see around our house too, I know that there's some intentional dumping going on there as well, which saddens me. Um, some of those things are questions of what do you even do about that? And so I've got a guest on today that is, I think, going to shed some light on that a little bit. But speaking to our waterways specifically, the waterways that we use for both drinking and recreation, whether it's playing in the creek behind the house or enjoying a day at the beach or on the lake, or even just drinking the water from your tap, your entire family is affected by this major resource. So I've brought in Ingrid Gronstal, who is the Water Program Director with the Iowa Environmental Council, and she's an expert to help us as community members learn how to contribute to keeping our waterways safe so that we can enjoy them in whatever capacity we take advantage of them in. Ingrid works not only with policy around creating measures to ensure safe water, but also educating community members on what they can do to contribute to the cause. She has a background in working with sustainability and safe farming practices and is going to give us some insights as to what we can do to help with the bigger picture of creating cleaner water systems. So thank you, Ingrid, for taking the time to be with us today, and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I've done a few interviews on podcasts previously, but this is one of my favorite formats. So I always jump at the chance to be interviewed on anyone's podcast. Really.
Well, good.
About anything. We can talk about anything.
Good, cool. So tell us a little bit about yourself, a little brief snippet of your background.
Sure. So I grew up in Carroll, Iowa, and I lived there my whole life until I graduated from high school. And then I wanted to go out and see the world, and so I decided to go to the University of Iowa for college. All the way
that's
over.
The world.
Yeah. Went all the way over to Eastern Iowa for college, and I did both undergrad and law school at the University of Iowa. But I would say, you can draw a direct line from my mom's family is from Estherville, Iowa, and my dad's side of the family had both sets of grandparents had houses on Spirit Lake up here in the Okoboji area. And so I came up here every summer, and we were just boating and swimming and playing outside, and I think you can draw a direct line from that to like wanting to work in environmental policy and wanting to work on water quality. And so when this job became available, I really jumped at the chance to do this work in my home state and, in my home waterways.
Absolutely. So you have a law background. So that's very cool then that you get to work with something that not only drives you to provide for yourself, but also is fueled by this passion for water and being on the water and making sure that we have those clean areas.
Yeah. And one of the things that's really fun about this job and kind of what I wanted to do, I did I did science in undergrad, and I really liked science, but I saw even as an undergrad, there was all this really good science going on, and then they'd publish results, and then it'd go in a scientific peer-reviewed journal and then sit on a shelf, right? And a lot of that really good work wasn't being translated into public policy and into solutions that actually made a difference on the ground. And that's a lot of what our organization does. We don't have any, hard science staff, but we are a science-based organization. We have partners and organizations that we work with to have empirical bases for all of our policy positions. But our job is to take their good work and say, okay, here's how you put this into a public policy solution that can actually improve waterways and improve people's lives here in the state based on this really good work that's going on. So that's a fun sort of translational aspect of our work. That I really like.
Very cool. So this topic of creating safe waters also stems from a couple experiences that I've had, and that just kind of got me thinking, like, I don't even know what you do when you see this ditch full of junk who do you even tell? I mean, obviously the landowner has to know about that, but somebody clearly is dumping regularly, and maybe it's the
Mm-hmm.
landowner, into this ditch where there's a creek. And how does that impact then the rest of our waterways?
Right. So I guess there's a couple of parts to that question. The first part is, what is your recourse, or who do you notify when you see something like that? Who's in
Yeah.
charge of, protecting public spaces or public environment? And then the second part of your question is, what kind of impact do these behaviors have on on our larger statewide environment? Um, so I think the first piece of that question, um, so I would say, and we don't do as much work. So I'll back up and say that Iowa Environmental Council, just quick background on us, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan law and policy organization. So we work primarily on clean water and clean energy in the state. We do a little bit of, recycling and waste work, but pretty much, as you said, in relation to how it might affect water. Not that we aren't concerned about, recycling and solid waste and that sort of thing in general, but we just don't have the capacity right now to do a lot of work on
Right.
that. Um, but I would say that one nice thing about us is that we have almost 80 member organizations across the state of Iowa. We also have almost 400 individual members, or a little over 400 individual members. So we have a lot of expertise and a lot of organizations that do care a lot about this. So, for example, Recycle Me Iowa is a member organization of ours. So that's a group that we would contact. Say if you contacted us and said, I'm seeing all this trash in someone's roadway, or ditch, or in a roadway, or on someone's land. What do I do about that? My first suggestion would be to call the Department of Natural Resources. So in the state of Iowa, the State Department of Natural Resources, most of them are familiar with the DNR from hunting and fishing, or
Right.
state parks. So there's two sides to the DNR. There's the hook and bullet side, is kind of the colloquialism, but the hunting, fishing, trapping, camping, lake protection, recreation side of it. And then there's the environmental protection side of it, which is the group that is in charge of enforcing, clean air laws, clean water laws, solid waste laws, and that sort of thing. So it's a pretty big and diverse organization in the state. And some other states like Minnesota split those into two organizations, but here it's together. So I would encourage, for that specific example, go on the DNR's website, look at, waste or illegal dumping, or that's a pretty common issue in Iowa. So they do actually have some resources available on their website or contact information that you can call. So one suggestion would be to call the Department of Natural Resources if you have concerns about anything in environmental protection in the state. That's going to cover it. Unless there's some agricultural issues, sometimes the DNR and the Department of Ag have sort of co-responsibilities or split responsibilities, but we can get into that later.
Sure.
But the second thing I would say is contact an organization like us, or contact us and say, hey, there's this, I have this question about the environment. Can you point me in the right direction? Or what do you know about this? Or is this an issue we should be concerned about? The reason that advocacy organizations like ours exist is to be a voice for Iowans in these spaces. So it's our job to know who to talk to and what regulations exist and what agencies are responsible for what, so that you don't have to know that, and then you can rely on our expertise, and then we can go and be a voice on your behalf. So there's a big role to play, I think, for organizations like ours. And when people start worrying about, what can I do or what difference can I make, sometimes it's as easy as just, supporting an organization like IEC or somebody, a different nonprofit that's doing work that you support and work that you're interested in, and, giving them the resources to go out and do that job.
Yeah, because collectively, then you guys are the big voice that can start to maybe make some of those changes, right?
Absolutely. And we can, when we go and talk to decision makers, we can say, hey, we've had, emails from people all around the state, not just in Des Moines. We've had, emails from people in Pella and Iowa City and Okoboji or wherever. And this is something people are concerned about on the ground, or this is something we've heard from your constituent about. and it's something you may want to take a closer look at. So,
Sure.
I think that's an important. I think if your listeners have one takeaway from this conversation, it's that your voice is always important, whether it's contacting an organization like ours or contacting your legislators or the governor's staff or regulatory agency staff directly. I think never underestimate the power that advocating on behalf of yourself and your community can have with decision makers, and that if those decision makers don't hear from you or don't know that it's an issue, they'll assume that it's not. And so there's a lot of power in there to voice concerns.
Cool. Okay, let's go back to I had mentioned that there was a couple incidences, and I didn't even think of the road ditch one until I was kind of doing the intro.
Yeah.
But one that I specifically mentioned to you the other day was that it was a farming incident, and I was driving across the river, and as I was driving, I looked down. This was a few years back. I don't know, it was probably 6 or 7 years back. And there was a farmer spraying his field, and it was right up next to the river, and there was really hardly any sort of a buffer strip there at all, and his sprayer was going right off into the river, clearly visible that he was spraying a strip into the river and not on the land itself. And I got home, and it just kind of made me sick to my stomach almost. Like, I don't even know who to talk to. I don't know who to call. I don't know what to do about that. Now I know, and you've just told us that, contacting the DNR or contacting your office is, those are actionable steps that someone could take if they were to see something like that. But how does that one farmer's act of carelessness affect the rest of us?
Well, I think it absolutely, I would say so there's a couple ways to answer that. Like in the universe of that one individual's action on that particular day, if it was just that person in that moment and, it was a one-time thing, it might, it probably wouldn't affect things that much. And the unfortunate thing is, I think that might be kind of what that person is thinking of at that time.
Sure.
Well, oh, this is just one time, or I'm one farmer and this is just my one field. And you hear a lot in our world, dilution is the solution to pollution, which is somewhat true. But if every person who's acting that way is assuming that they're an individual actor and, their small contribution doesn't make that much of a difference in the large scheme, I think on a cumulative basis, and I think that what the science is showing is that, that does make a difference. And so that can have an extreme impact. And the other thing with particularly rivers is that rivers, are cumulative. So if you think of how a watershed works, and for your listeners, if they're not familiar with watershed, basically that just means the area of land that drains into a waterway. And so you can have huge watersheds, like the Mississippi River watershed I think, includes parts of 31 states, all, in the middle of the country, that all drains into Louisiana and the Gulf of Mexico. So everything coming from those different waterways is ending up in the Gulf of Mexico.
So this was going into the Des Moines River. That goes exactly there, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so even if you think this is a discrete spot up in Iowa, and even let's not say like the Des Moines River is pretty big. Let's say it's some little creek, like the creek that runs through, your neighbor's, field or whatever, unnamed creek, tiny thing, right? Like that creek flows into a stream that flows into a tributary river that flows into the Des Moines. So even that small piece, it's going to flow into the Des Moines, which flows into the Mississippi. And so these things accumulate over time. And even if the pollution is fairly dilute up here, it's going to be huge down further in the watershed. So you need to think of not only how it's affecting your immediate community, but how it affects your downstream neighbors. And one easier way to maybe think of that is if you think about, if you kind of analogize this to flooding. So You have, the reason you have crushes of water downstream is that you've been bringing in water from upstream. So maybe that water coming into the stream upstream isn't a huge issue for those people, but it becomes an issue downstream. And so those upstream neighbors need to think about how their actions on the river are going to affect people downstream, both in terms of water quality and quantity.
So does that affect, it obviously is affecting all the marine life that's going
Mm-hmm.
through the waters and even on into the ocean. But does it affect our drinking water?
Yes, I would say yes, absolutely. So we have, um, so there's a couple of different things there. So drinking water utilities have permit requirements. So they're governed by the Safe Drinking Water Act, which was one of the main, a lot of our big environmental laws were passed in the 70s. Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Safe Drinking Water Act is another one of those pillars. So our public utilities have to follow those requirements. And so Iowa has really high, our surface waters have pretty high nitrate concentrations, and our public water utilities have to deal with that, and they have to install equipment that has to address that nitrate. So the water coming from that facility for drinking water and anything that they discharge has to meet those standards for nitrate, and has to be protective of public health and the environment. But I think one of the problems is that they have to deal with contaminants that, again, as you're talking, are coming from different places in the watershed, though. And in this state, that's primarily from agricultural production. And I've heard this even in the Pella area. I went to Central College last fall and heard Secretary of Ag Mike Naig speak, and he spoke about the efforts that farmers are doing across the state to reduce nutrient pollution in waterways. There was a fellow who worked for Pella Utilities, and he commented that the utilities plants in Pella were struggling to meet their permit requirements, and that has effects on ratepayers in the city, and people who have to pay to have the utility build nutrient removal, nitrate removal systems or other technological solutions to water treatment. And his question was sort of, is there a way that we could more equitably distribute this responsibility for cleaning up pollution, so that, agricultural production takes some more of that burden? Because right now, point sources, so utilities do have permit requirements, but any action on agricultural land is completely voluntary. And so, is there a different policy approach that we can take? And I know that wasn't exactly an answer to your question, but I think that our surface water quality is very tied to our drinking water quality and public health, and our utilities do a good job of meeting those requirements, but it's getting more and more difficult for them to meet those requirements because of increasing pollution from other sources in our waterways. And so again, I think this is an area where everyone is connected, and so there needs to be sort of a balanced approach to addressing these problems that takes that into account.
Yeah, and that's huge because they're just passing the expense then on to the consumer who may
Mm-hmm.
have no idea that really the reason that their costs are increasing for their drinking water and for their health is because of all the runoff from the farmland or the pollution that may be out there that's getting into the waterways, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
Okay.
this is not to point fingers or place blame.
Right.
I think, our analysis of the situation is that it's sort of a public policy failure because we haven't put the policies in place to both incentivize farmers for doing the right thing and to, make it so there's some consequence if you don't, at least do the bare minimum in terms of, controlling your own pollution coming from your operation. And so I think that, we would suggest a different balancing of interests and, across the state so that everyone, has some skin in the game.
Right. That makes sense. But overall, would you say that clean drinking water is fairly accessible in our state?
I would say so, yes. And I think that's actually something we are continuing to work on. So there's a couple of pieces to this. One, do we have enough science to understand what level drinking water needs to be at to be clean? So if you take nitrate, for example, the nitrate drinking water standard is 10 milligrams per liter. And that's based on studies that were done in the 50s and primarily concerned with blue baby syndrome. So to be protective against blue baby syndrome, that's the standard, and that's accurate to blue baby syndrome. But since that time,
I don't even know what blue baby syndrome is, and I have 3 children.
Sure.
So I have not had blue babies, apparently.
It sounds scary, and it sounds like what you would expect from the description. So it's a high nitrate in drinking water. High nitrate concentrations for infants can cause respiratory failure or,
sure,
infants turning blue, and that was a problem in the earlier part of the 20th century, and so that was part of Safe Drinking Water Act standards and research, and they brought those standards in to be protective of that. So that's a success story in that sense, right? That you don't know what that is.
Right.
So that public policy has been effective, and so drinking water has been safe to that standard for that particular health outcome.
But you still wouldn't feed, like we use infant water for mixing anything with our infant. Why is that? I guess now I've got other questions. I know it has something to do with just regular tap water being not palatable, acceptable for babies. I don't know. What is it?
So I don't, I can't speak to that. I can't speak to other. So I don't have kids, and so I don't know as much about that specifically, right? Or how. And I think obviously what individuals choose to protect the health and safety of their babies. Obviously, like I think that's I think that parents should do whatever they need to do to make sure they feel safe and how they're caring for their infants. I would say that, and we work with utilities a lot, and again, they do a good job of meeting the standards that are set for them. So I would say, like, I drink tap water, throughout the state. I'm fairly comfortable with that from what I know of the standards that are set and the utilities' ability to meet them. So I think our utilities do a good job of that. Where I was going with this discussion of 10 milligrams per liter is that since that standard was set, there have been studies showing that high nitrate concentrations can also lead to increased risk of certain kinds of cancer, like bladder cancer and other cancers. And there are studies indicating that 5 milligrams per liter might be a more protective standard. And so when we look at public policy issues like this, our first question is, what does the science say? And, is the standard actually protective? And I would say, in this case, for some things it is, and for some things it might not be. That's not the utilities' fault. That's, a
that's
public
just
policy.
That the policy has been in place since the 50s. Right. So
that's a policy level. They need to meet the standards that they're told to meet. So that's a job for decision makers and legislative and agency level policy to make sure that their guidance is up to the latest science and that they follow those. They're continuing to be protective of human health and the environment. So one, look at the standard. Is the standard protective? Is it protective for various things? Because again, when you say clean drinking water, that could mean a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts, depending on what you're concerned about. One thing, Ted Corrigan of Des Moines Waterworks, I've heard him say in a couple of different public fora is, the current standards are very good at, we don't have cholera outbreaks, right? Because our current standards are protective of that. So, it's clean in a lot of ways, but there are emerging things that we maybe know less about, that organizations like ours try to get out in front of and say, maybe we should be concerned about this, or maybe we should bring up more research, or maybe this is an area where we should beef up public policy because the regulations are behind what we know from a science perspective. The second thing I would say about drinking water is that not all sources are equal. So our public water supplies are pretty good at providing safe drinking water. There's the Safe Drinking Water Act, there's regulations. It's pretty tightly, monitored and enforced by the DNR. But there are a lot of people in rural Iowa, for example, that maybe get their water from private wells, and those are not covered by the Safe Drinking Water Act. So,
do people still use wells?
Oh yeah, a lot.
For drinking though, I guess. I can't remember
Absolutely.
growing up. We had well water until, I don't know if it was when I was in college or when I was in high school that rural water finally came to us.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I must have been in college.
Mm-hmm.
But there's still places in Iowa that just go off of the well and don't have rural water or don't have access to that?
A lot. And I'll have to, I might look up really quickly what the percentage is, but we did a study, or we collaborated with Environmental Working Group last year to look at private well testing data in the state of Iowa. And one, I would say, so I think there's a high percentage of Iowans that, hundreds of thousands of Iowans is what I remember, but I'll look up the exact number, but still get their water from private wells.
That's incredible.
And those wells are not covered under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So Safe Drinking Water Act, you have to do testing of all your water that's coming out of your facility. There's standards you have to set against, you have to continue monitoring. There's the DNR comes and does inspections. None of that happens for private wells. They're required to get the well tested when it's installed, and that's it.
Wow.
There's no testing required after that. And so there's a lot of people who don't know that they maybe should be getting their wells tested, or that there are resources available for testing. So the state of Iowa has a program called Grants to Counties, and it provides for funding for county public health or county sanitarians to come out and do free testing of private well water. And that's something that, not a lot of people who own private wells have taken advantage of. So there's not nearly enough testing being done, or nearly enough on a regular basis. And then of the wells that have been tested, a significant number have nitrate and bacteria levels higher than the drinking water standards in the Safe Drinking Water Act. So people are drinking contaminated water, and probably in areas where they don't have access to rural water or other sources of clean water. So they're drinking from these wells. They don't know what's in them, and they don't have a lot of other options for finding safe drinking water. So again, that's an issue where we talk about, okay, what is happening in these areas or in these watersheds that is causing contamination in these wells, and can we have more community-based solutions so that everyone in your community can be guaranteed that they have safe drinking water. And this is something where sometimes this conversation gets characterized as urban versus rural, and I think that's an example of drinking water as an issue. Everyone has a right to clean drinking water, and that's an issue wherever you go. And any activities in a watershed affect anyone else in that activity. And in these cases, rural activities in the watershed also affect, their neighbors in their own communities. And so,
yeah, for sure.
And upstream communities of them are affecting other neighbors downstream. So I think it's this idea of, can we have a more equitable approach that is protective of everyone? Because at the very bare minimum, everyone should be able to have clean water. And I think, a moment like this kind of, again, throws into sharp relief public health affects everyone, and risks to public health affect everyone. And so I think there does need to be a more community level response to public health concerns. Maybe, and not all of them are as acute as coronavirus, but I think no less important and no less, deadly to people. I think that this is people have to drink water. And so,
Absolutely. And these are things that are happening in our own neighborhoods, in our own backyard, basically, that
mhm,
this is not a foreign country. This
mhm,
is, hey, the school maybe in the next county over is not drinking safe water, or the families that go to that school are not drinking safe water, whatever it may be.
yeah.
These are things that hopefully we can have some sort of impact on, because this is our state. This is our
Mhm,
own backyard. Like, there's got to be a way to make some changes so that everybody has access to clean water. We usually don't think of that in our state. We think of the fact
mhm,
that, oh, it's people in another country maybe who don't have clean water or safe water to be drinking, but it's
mhm.
happening right here. Um, is there anything in our homes that we can do aside from, if you drink off of a well, or if you have a well, getting that tested? Then what do
Mhm.
you do if your well water comes back and it tests unsafe, or it has high nitrate levels, or even if you take that statistic of 10 milligrams per liter of what is the standard and say
Mhm.
that I don't even want, because I know that there are other studies that cause other things. I want to lower that level. What can you do in your own home to do that?
One thing. So yeah, so private wells. I would say if you have a private well, and this was actually a funny, not funny, interesting anecdote that my husband's parents live on an acreage north of Ames, just outside of Story City. And when I first started working on this, my husband said, "Well, I'm sure that my parents get their well tested every year." And then he finally went back and talked to his folks, and he said, "Well, my dad said they haven't had their well tested in 15 years." And then he started getting kind of panicky, uh, and I was like, "Oh, so you mean when we've been going up and visiting, we might, it might not be the cleanest water." But that's, I think, some of, people have a lot to worry about, and people have a lot of things that they have to remember to do, and this is just one more thing. And so it's not like, people. It's not like it's something that, some kind of poor reflection on them for not getting well tested. It's just,
It's like
another
time goes
thing.
by, and
Yeah,
and before you know it, oh my gosh, it's been 5 years, it's been
yeah,
10 years, it's been 15 years, and no, we haven't had that tested. We haven't done
yeah,
anything
yeah.
about that.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And so it's something you just kind of assume is going to be there. So no, again, like this is not our job is not to, point fingers or criticize, but it's sort of okay, this seems to be a gap in public policy. And so where do we find solution to that? And so I think that's part of our outreach and education, is make people aware that their county public health officials have resources available to them. Advocate for more resources for mitigation. So there are resources for testing, but then there aren't really state resources for mitigation. And so, that's not all that helpful to those people to say, well, you're drinking unsafe water. You have a nice day. So what are things that we can put in place to help people mitigate that? Because sometimes it is fairly costly to if you have to dig a new well, or if you have to put in,
Right.
reverse osmosis or whatever those are. I would say for people on public water, if you're concerned about your water supply, or concerned about your the safety of your drinking water, one thing the Safe Drinking Water Act requires is for every drinking water utility to publish an annual consumer confidence report. And so you can look up your utility's consumer confidence report and look at what their testing has said, what their monitoring has said, what they're required to do, and how they have fulfilled those requirements. So that might be one, and it's supposed to be written for consumers. So it's not a highly technical document. You're not being forced to read, code language or regulations or that sort of thing. So that might be an area for people to know how their local utility is doing, and maybe B, just get a little more educated on what is being tested and what's not. I think that's something that's also surprising to people, is that just because water is being monitored, it's not being monitored for everything. So it's being monitored for things that are regulatorily required. And so there are emerging contaminants like, I think something that's in the news quite a bit that we don't work on as much is like hormones or things like that are newer in the water supply since the 70s. That that maybe newer, people, yes. That people should be, concerned about or paying attention to, that aren't there. So those consumer confidence reports give you a list of what they are monitoring, and then you can see what is also not being monitored in that, and are there other things that we should be concerned about. And then I would say, just again, kind of like I said at the beginning, our approach is more, so I would say first that public utilities do a good job of providing you safe drinking water. So, they do a good job of providing water that's safe to the regulations that exist currently. So I think for people in their own homes, individual action is important, but I think especially on these larger structural policy issues, engaging at a higher level, engaging with an organization like us that's looking at the balance across various industries, or engaging with your decision makers directly and saying, hey, are you sure that these regulations that we have in place are protective? Or I'm concerned about this thing, I didn't see it in the consumer confidence report, or I read my utilities consumer confidence report and I have questions about XYZ. I think that's a good place to start as far as becoming educated and making sure you're informed on what's going on in your community and what water quality actually looks like as far as drinking water.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's good to know as well. So let's wrap up this drinking water portion, and I don't know, actionable steps for people. Basically, if you're on a well, get your well tested and know what is in it. And if not, trust that, yes, our utility companies are doing the work that they need to remove those levels. When your utility bill or water bill goes up, it could be that it's because they're having to pay more to remove some of those harmful chemicals that may be in the water supply system, right? Mm-hmm. So being able to connect with a group like yours is important. Just knowing that's the presence of those pollutants that are being put into the water systems from whether it's litter, pollution, farming, it all affects everybody's drinking water, no matter if we're in Iowa or in Louisiana and at the Gulf of Mexico. It's important to remember that what we do here in Iowa or wherever you are to create a clean environment, especially in terms of water, could have a drastic impact on people and life thousands of miles away in terms of both drinking water and recreational use for waters, which we're going to talk about next week in part 2 of this episode. Ingrid shared a ton of information on ways that you can get involved even at the most basic level, and you'll hear some more next week as well. But I guess one other takeaway that I want to offer up to you is the use of some sort of filtration system for your water. This can be as basic as using a carbon filter or a water pitcher that has a filter in it, or it could be as intense as installing some sort of reverse osmosis water filtration system within your home, which can be a little bit pricier. The point is, having that sort of or some sort of a filtration system for your water to go through is just one more step of creating cleaner drinking water for yourself. It's not that the public utilities don't do a good job. They do, as Ingrid said, and they're meeting the standards that have been put out there to them. But if you want to take it one step farther, then adding a basic water filter or water filter pitcher to your home might give you a little bit more protection from some of the chemicals that may still reside in your water at higher levels than you may be comfortable consuming. And it also doesn't take away from any of the natural occurring salts and minerals that our bodies need that we get from water. A couple links for you to be aware of that I will add to the show notes page is the Iowa Environmental Council. That's who Ingrid works for. That's who she is the water program director for, and where you can find more information on what they do and ways that you can get involved. I'll also link to the Grants to Counties Water Well program that Ingrid mentioned. In case anyone out there is on a well and you're in the state of Iowa, there's some further information and reading for you there. And I will finish my conversation with Ingrid next week when we actually talk about water quality and safety and how pollution affects the water resources that we use for recreation. I know this is deep stuff, but it's also really important stuff because, like I said before, and like Ingrid said, the choices that we make in how we treat our environment and what we put into the environment affects so many other people. And water is one clear source that we have definite and visible evidence of that. So consider today or this week or whenever it is that you're listening to this episode, what you can do to help improve the environment, whether it's with the water or in some other way. We all play a role in preserving our planet so that future generations can enjoy it. And one more note that if you haven't subscribed to the podcast on some sort of podcast listening directory, I would be so grateful if you would take just a moment to do that. You can find links to a lot of those directories in the show notes. Happy Earth Day and cheers to cultivating more health, harmony, and happiness in your life. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thanks for tuning in. If you like what you hear, help us grow this podcast by sharing it with even just one other person. And it would mean so much to me if you would take a moment of your time to write a review. Your comments and feedback are what help me continue to bring you topics and guests that can help you and others on their journey in creating health, harmony, and happiness. Remember to head on over to CairnYogaWellness.com to get the show notes and links from today's episode. Follow me on Facebook and Instagram at Cairn Yoga Wellness, and to continue connecting with more resources that could help you enhance health, harmony, and happiness in your own life, subscribe to this podcast. Thanks again for listening.